Hello again. So in this video we're going to be baking all of this procedural mess down into a set of 4 PBR materials that you can then use portably if you're uploading it to, say, Sketchfab or wherever, or selling it on various marketplaces. Because we're using different height maps in the procedural material, we're going to need to rebake the normal, which is why I duplicated this version of the Claymore away from the low poly version. I'm just setting this up now and putting the pieces back where they were for rebaking normals. But what we're going to do is apply the procedural material to the low poly version, and then we're going to bake that onto the duplicate. First we're going to do the diffuse colour though. So one thing that's very important with that is you need to disable the metallic on the second part of the material, because if you have metallic on there it reflects light and it just makes a mess of it. Usually your render will turn out completely black, save for a few pieces of emission or anything that's catching a strong highlight. So this is very similar to the previous baking video. The setup is pretty much identical. I'm not going to do a super precise normal map bake with a cage. I'm just going to use the default values. So again, for the diffuse, turn off the direct and indirect colour. Set the distance to 0.0035. And this time we're going to be baking the low poly onto the duplicate. The duplicate needs to have a new material assigned, and then you just set up the image viewer with a new material, and then put that same material in as an image texture on the duplicate. Just baking this down now. And you see we get all the colour information. Oh, one thing to remember while you're doing this is, I'm not sure if it affects it or not, but I turned off the render visibility for the high poly because sometimes the overlap causes problems. So if I plug that in now, you can see that we've just got the greens and the browns. So the browns are in where the crevices are, the green everywhere else, and the bits that are metallic are kind of white / light grey. For the roughness, it's very similar, so you don't need to change too much. Just set up a new map, set up a new image. Make sure you save the diffuse to your desktop as well, or wherever you want to save it to. Set up the roughness, change it to non-colour, change it to roughness in the bake settings. All the other settings are the same, and then just click bake. Make sure you've selected the low poly and then the duplicate. It's named Claymore on my scene, and make sure that roughness is the image texture that's selected in the material in the shader window. Also, a random tip: if you're showing rendered mode, rendered shading on the left hand panel, it will take slightly longer to render because you're using more VRAM. Okay, that's the roughness image, so save that as well. Next we're going to do the normal map. Same again, make a 4K image up there. Add an image texture down here. Change it to non-colour, very important step. So we won't need to bake a metal map for this. The reason being the colour mask we used earlier, the colour mask we made earlier, that gave us basically a black and white image, and that will also serve as the metallic map, because that's all we'd get from that. We want white where it's metal and black where it's not. But normally, if you want to bake a metal map, you need to plug it into an emission shader. So if you've got a procedural or a whole texture file set up for where metal parts are, basically have that, instead of plugging it into a principal BSDF, have it plugged into an emission shader, and in the bake settings change it to emissive that you're baking, and that will give you your black and white image that you need. The way I've done this is so that you can, where I've rebaked the normal, this is so that you can get the normal information from the edges and the normal information from the texture sort of overlapping each other. There is another way of combining normals, which I've mentioned in a previous video, but if you search up on YouTube, there is a way you can do that in Photoshop. It does take a while, but you can also record it as an action, so you can just click a button and it does it all. Okay, put all that piece back together now, and applied all those PBR materials to it, and you can see that is the whole piece. That is now the low poly with basically no more than 4 image textures applied to it. One additional step I've just remembered that we need to do is on the diffuse, we need to overlap the ambient occlusion. So in Photoshop or whatever image software, paste the ambient occlusion over the top and change it to multiply, and then save that down as the new diffuse map. And you can see when I enabled that, it just added some shadows around things like the text on the front of the claymore. Just in a new scene now, I'm just going to set up that whole material again. So we're adding 1 image texture, and we're just going to duplicate that 4 times. That's for the base colour, the metallic, the roughness, and the normal. And then we need a normal map to convert the normal data. So that's the new diffuse that we're just loading in there with the ambient occlusion multiplied over the top already, saved in. Plug that straight into the base colour. Next, the metal map, which is basically the colour mask that we used from earlier. Change that to non-colour and plug that into metallic. Just going to move them up for a bit of space. The roughness map, again, change it to non-colour. And lastly, the normal map. And just plug that into the normal slot. Okay, that's the complete material set up. And if we go over into rendered mode, you can see that's the low poly with all of the materials applied to it, procedurally baked down into PBR maps. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial series. It's been quite a long video to make, but I hope you're happy with the result. If you found this tutorial useful, a subscribe would be fantastic. Thank you for watching and take care.